Welcome to AudioFile's A Dickens of Davids conversation. AudioFile is the #1 source in the world for audiobook reviews, and we're happy to have you here today. So you'll notice that there is a Q&A box. That is where you want to drop your questions. If you have any questions, just drop them into the Q&A box, not the chat box that's at the bottom of your screen. If they go into the chat box, we might not see them, and we do hope to take your questions, so don't be shy with those. Now, why are we talking about David Copperfield? Well, because this is the first title in our serialized audiobook new podcast called Audiobook Break. And in fact, Nick Boulton, one of our guests today, narrates that particular version of David Copperfield, which was originally published by our friends at Naxos Audiobooks. I've got some amazing talents here with me today, and we've brought just a few people together. Let's start off with audiophile golden voice Martin Jarvis, OBE. He's known for starring as Jeeves on Broadway, for which he won a Theatre World Award. He's a prolific acting and directing career, including doing a lot of audiobooks, BBC dramas, and movies such as The Titanic. And we've got our winner of 72 I think we're out of order here. That's all right. I can pivot. We've got Nicholas Boulton, who we're going to call Nick today because we're friendly. He is a multi-award-winning audiobook narrator. He's a popular video game and voice actor and an experienced stage, screen, and radio actor. And he's appeared on TV in many productions, including Game of Thrones. Maybe you've heard of that. He was a member of the BBC Repertory Company, and he's known for his facility with accents. And this is, of course, part of his audiobook work. And he has, of course, won many AudioFile Earphones awards. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about our friend Simon Vance, who has won 72 Earphones awards. He is also an AudioFile Golden Voice narrator, as is Martin. And he has been recording audiobooks for more than 35 years, beginning when he was a BBC radio newsreader presenter. And he has now achieved more Audie nominations for single voice titles than any other male narrator on the planet. And of course, we have Derek Perkins, who's been a professional narrator since 2012. He has nearly 500 audiobooks to his name, and he's won Audies, SOVA, AudioFile Best Voice in various categories, and Earphones Awards, including one for David Copperfield. And he is the author of Audiobook Narration Manual for Aspiring Narrators. All right, so we have so many great questions here today and so many exciting things to talk about and to listen to from these four. I know you're looking forward to hearing them speak, so I'm just going to leave you with this. The video recording of today's events will be available on the AudioFile YouTube channel by early next week. And if you have a question for any of the narrators on today's webinar, please put that in the Q&A box, not the chat box. All right. Let's turn things over to the group here, and I'll ask you all to unmute because we've got a great question for you. How familiar were you with David Copperfield before you narrated the audiobook? So was it read aloud to you as a child? Had you read it as a book previously, or had you never read it before? We'll start with Nick, whose version we're hearing on Audiobook Break.
I hadn't read it before I recorded it. I was familiar with it. I'm sure I'd read excerpts from it when I was at school, studying various bits of Dickens and so on. And of course, I was familiar with I think it's the 1935 film with W.C. Fields and everyone else. So yes, it was definitely part of my consciousness, although I hadn't delved deeply into it.
What about you, Derek?
Very similar to what Nick said, actually. Hadn't ever read it through. I'm one of those kids who was lucky that their father read to them when they were young, and so I'm sure that somewhere along the line he would have read extracts, but I don't remember him doing the whole thing. But no, I had the pleasure of reading it all through a couple of times when I did the recording.
How about Simon?
Yes, well, I think being brought up in England, there are so many classic series on TV. I think that's my acquaintance with it in the 60s. I didn't get it read to me, and I certainly don't remember doing Copperfield at school, but I'm very familiar with the series on TV and the various films. You mentioned the 1935 version. Of course, there are so many, and but it was a joy to read the whole book myself. But that was the first time I had gone in detail into the story, although I was familiar with it. Yeah.
Wow, I'm shocked that none of you had read it before. Martin, you're our last chance. Had you read it before you read it?
Well, half and half. At school, we sat around with our very nice English teacher, and we read a shortened version of David Copperfield. But what they used to do was that you'd read a bit, and then it would go on to somebody at the next desk, and then the next desk. So I won't say I really got it. I didn't kind of have joy with it because I didn't fully follow what was going on. Later on, I found that I was reading it, not yet for audiobook, but just because I got very interested in Dickens. And then I had a piece of luck in the middle to late 70s where I was offered to do it on BBC TV. And I was actually asked to play David Copperfield because I'd recently just done Nicholas Nickleby playing Nick. And I stuck crossed my fingers, I should say, really, and said, I'd love to play Uriah Heep. And our wonderful director, Joan Craft, the great Dickensian director of the 60s and 70s, said, oh, darling, you couldn't possibly play Uriah. You just played Nick. And I said, may I audition for you? And she said, well, you don't need to. And I said, I'll come and may I read just a little bit of Uriah Heep? So I went in there very nervously and I read a scene or two, and she turned to her producer and said, well, I don't know about you, darling, but I thought that was bloody good. And before I got home, I got the part of Uriah Heep. So I then delved and had the joy of working with Arthur Lowe, who played Mr. Micawber, and Patricia Routledge, and many other fine actors, David Yelland as David Copperfield. And that was the beginning of my obsession, really, with Copperfield and continuing keenness on all things Dickens.
So now, why is Uriah Heep your favorite?
Why is he my favorite? I suppose because I studied him the most at first. Also because he is one of literature's great villains. I like the fact that he is not an obvious villain. You know how when here in England, you know, you might go to the pantomime and you can't wait for the villain to come on, melodrama and all the rest of it. Uriah is not like that. He's very courteous. He, you wonder, you know, is he quite nice? And very, very shortly you realize that he's not helpful. He is double-dyed and very, very clever and very, very bright. And you could say he's the sort of shadow other level of Copperfield himself. Copperfield is not perfect by any means, slightly neurotic, psychologically, got some problems, but he's ambitious and he's moving forward and so on. And Heap, too, in his own and very different way, is extremely ambitious. And of course, as we learn in the book, they both have great connections with Agnes Wickfield. Heap, because he wants to marry her. David doesn't want to marry her at first, but they become great friends. And no spoilers here. I wonder what happens to them in the end.
Well, I think that's a great transition. We will actually transition to Martin reading a little bit of David Copperfield, and he picked a section with Uriah Heep, of course.
Well, I did, and this is a section because they're really quite young when we first meet Uriah, who's working for Mr. Wickfield as a clerk. And David, slightly patronizingly, says, well, I could teach you Latin if you like, Uriah. And they're on the way walking from Wickfield's to Uriah's house where his mum and he live. And he's just replying to the offer of being taught Latin by this clever David. Oh, indeed, you must excuse me, Master Copperfield. Now, I'm greatly obliged, and I should like it of all things, I assure you, but I'm far too humble. There are people enough to tread upon me in my lowly state without my doing outrage to their feelings by possessing learning. Learning ain't for me. A person like myself had better not aspire. If he is to get on in life, he must get on humbly, Master Copperfield. I never saw his mouth so wide or the creases in his cheeks so deep as when he delivered himself of these sentiments, shaking his head all the time and writhing modestly. Oh, I think you're wrong, Uriah, I said. I dare say there are several things that I could teach you if you would like to learn them. Oh, I don't doubt that, Master Copperfield, he answered. No, not in the least. For not being humble yourself, you don't judge well, perhaps, for them that are. I won't provoke my betters with knowledge. Thank you. I'm much too humble. Oh, here is my humble dwelling, Master Copperfield.
Lovely. We've got some great questions coming in. So I'm going to invite Simon, who's going to read next, to answer one of them, actually. And that is, how do you arrive at the voices that you're going to use for each of the characters? And once you've chosen those voices, how do you keep them consistent, especially in a long book like David Copperfield?
It's a good question, because there are different ways that I know other narrators work. I know Jim Dale tends to decide voices beforehand and practices them and gets them recorded and makes sure they're all nuanced and so on. I tend to be a little bit more instinctual, which could be the lazy guy's way of doing it, but I tend to be in the book, absorb what's going on. If you're lucky, the author has described the character or given many clues about the character as before the person speaks. And I always thought Dickens did that very well. Even just the naming of the characters, Mr. Jolly or something like that, so you generally know, you've got an idea of what the character should sound like. But I was reading recently somewhere that said that he didn't do that. So it must be in my mind, because I've done a lot of Dickens. But it tends to just come to me in the moment. And because I fortunately mostly work alone, if in the moment it doesn't work for me in a page or two, then I'll go back and I'll nuance it, and then I'll work into it and so on. And it's not that I haven't read beforehand. I've looked at the characters, but I tend not to pick the characters beforehand. It's sort of, like I said, I'm lazy. It seems like too much work to do pages and pages of work before you get into the book. So I work on my instinct. In terms of how I keep them in my head, it's that whole, it's the movie in the head thing that narrators work with. You see the people moving about the stage. And so they have a physical shape and a size, and the name is attached to that. Often, if it might be a character that, I don't know, you mentioned Arthur Lowe, Martin, and if you're thinking in your head, oh, Arthur, I could be a kind of an Arthur Lowe voice. So I would do that. I'm not going to do it now because I can't think of it right now, but and I wouldn't be mimicking Arthur Lowe. I'd be Simon Vance doing Arthur Lowe, which to anybody else could be anybody. But for me, it suits that character, and so that character becomes an Arthur Lowe, aka Arthur Lowe. Uriah Heep, aka Arthur Lowe, which would be really strange. But anyway, so that sticks in my head through the book. So if they turn up 50 chapters later on, I go, oh, that's right, that was the Arthur Lowe kind of guy. So yeah, I think that answers the question.
I think so too. Now, who is your favorite character in David Copperfield?
You ask this question, it's so hard because they're all so wonderful. On all the Dickensian characters, it's so hard to pick one out above all others. I chose Mr. Micawber, I think because we talked about how we were familiar with the story, and I think the first thing I was aware of was Mr. Micawber was W.C. Fields as Mr. Micawber. That's a classic. And he's been so adorably played down the years. I don't remember seeing the Arthur Lowe Micawber, but recently Peter Capaldi did a wonderful job in the recent Iannucci version. And I think he's adorable. he's a perennial optimist in his way. Sort of always something's going to turn up. And he comes out with these wonderful aphorisms or whatever they are, and never lives by them, the whole thing. And I feel I have a connection with that, because the whole thing about, income £20 a year, expenditure £19 sixpence, wonderful, £19, 19 shillings and sixpence. If you spend £20 and sixpence, then it's a nightmare. And I think he never lived by that. I mean, he made a mess of his debts and everything. And I feel some connection there, because I was never very good with money. And I think we're full of these wonderful ideas that we don't live by. And I think he's and I love that the end of it. No, that would be a spoiler, wouldn't it? I mean,
don't tell us the end.
I'm not going to do that. But he has a very crucial part to play in the whole plot and the unraveling of, again, spoilers. I'll stop.
Well, then, we can't wait to get this taste. Let's actually hear you do a little reading.
Yes, absolutely. So he's talking to, he's with his wife and he's talking to David. "My dear young friend," said Mr. Micawber, "I am older than you, a man of some experience in life and of some experience, in short, in difficulties, generally speaking. At present, and until something turns up, which I am, I may say, hourly expecting, I have nothing to bestow but advice. Still, my advice is so far worth taking that, in short, that I have never taken it myself, and am the..." Here Mr. Micawber, who had been beaming and smiling all over his head and face up to the present moment, checked himself and frowned. "The miserable wretch you behold." "My dear Micawber," urged his wife. "I say," returned Mr. Micawber, quite forgetting himself and smiling again, "the miserable wretch you behold. My advice is, never do tomorrow what you can do today. Procrastination is the thief of time. Collar him, my poor papa's maxim," Mrs. Micawber observed. "My dear," said Mr. Micawber, "your papa was very well in his way, and heaven forbid that I should disparage him. Take him for all in all, we ne'er shall, in short, make the acquaintance, probably, of anybody else possessing, at his time of life, the same legs for gaiters, and able to read the same description of print without spectacles. But he applied that maxim to our marriage, my dear, and that was so far prematurely entered into in consequence that I never recovered the expense."
Lovely. Thank you so much, Simon.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to move on to Derek now. Now, Derek, I actually have sort of a nuts and bolts question about being an audiobook narrator. What is your favorite time of day to record?
Oh, anytime. That's a good question. Well, I suppose, if I'm honest, I would say the second two, I break my day up into 4 sessions, 4 separate recording sessions. So I do 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. And if I'm being honest, I would say that I think I probably am at my best and therefore enjoy it most during the 2nd and 3rd sessions, before lunch, after lunch. I enjoyed all the time, but that's when I feel like I'm completely grooved in. I'm warmed up. My voice is ready. I'm totally and utterly present. So that's the answer to that. But having said that, I enjoy this whole audiobook narration journey from start to finish, from the beginning of the day to the end of it.
Now we're going to hear a little of you reading your favorite character, but I'm going to ask you one more nuts and bolts question before. So we've heard Martin read and we've heard Simon read, and they're kind of reading, as we say, in continuous flow. So they're, reading the words on the page and skipping in and out of characters. Do you ever do that differently, where you would splice in the he said, she said later?
No. No, I couldn't. I can't work like that. I seem to recall some time ago, Simon, at one of the APACs, I talked to you briefly, or somebody mentioned briefly that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you did tend to at least do corrections separately later on. You didn't do them on the fly. I may be wrong in that, But my answer to your question is no, I don't splice in at all. For the similar reason to the one I just mentioned, which is, I find that I get into a flow, and the only thing I want to disturb or disrupt that flow is doing a correction, getting rid of a mistake at the time. So no, utterly not. I find it sounds more difficult, but I find it easier to, just dive in and out of the character on the fly, as it were.
Yeah, Simon, please jump in.
I just was just to make sure we correct this. I don't cut in and whatever and so on and so forth. I'm not sure. It may be a confusion. I did do a book once which had it was an oral history with many different characters, and it was the Beatles, if they were zombies or something like that. And I did I did all Paul and all John and all George Martin and stuff, and then I spliced that together. But it was paragraphs of their stuff. No, I mean I've met people who ask me and say, do you narrators, do you do all the women voices, or do you do it and then you put them in? No, it really, I'm with Derek on that. It's just it's impossible to do that. I think I've heard of a case of it being done, but it's so difficult. It's the flow. It's the movie in your head. Everybody is.
I totally agree. A movie in the head is a terrific way of expressing it. The only time that you might need to do the correction, and we perhaps none of us have yet come up against this, but I know people that have, is that when you've done, say, Mr. Lorimer, say in Copperfield, who's a kind of slightly Jeevesian butler, and you're quite pleased with yourself with the way that he's been slightly patronizing and so on, and then he comes back again. I don't think he actually does in Copperfield, but let's say he did. And then David suddenly says, and he reminded me so much of Lorimer and his broad Irish accent. And of course, you've done Lorimer as being slightly London. What am I going to do? I'm going to have to do him all again at the beginning. So that's something where perhaps you have got to just prepare just that little bit to be sure you don't come up against it.
Yes, the pre-read is always good. All right, so Derek, we're going to turn to you for your reading, and you have picked the character of Barkis. Why is he your favorite?
Well, as Simon said, it's almost impossible to pick one single favorite. There are so many. Plus, Martin Jarvis had stolen my Uriah Heep character before I got to it, so I didn't have a choice. But I actually picked Barkis, who's a minor character, obviously, in this. There's just something about him I like. I find that there's talking of Uriah Heep. There's a genuine humbleness about Barkis. Who of course is the carrier, the driver of the horse cart that takes David Copperfield between Yarmouth and his home, and I just find myself relating to this kind of horny-handed, not son of the soil in his case, but driver of the horse cart, and a sort of a genuine man, an honest man as far as we can tell. But he also injects a little bit of levity in the way, this slightly odd way that he talks, the odd request that he gets David to get in between as a bit of a matchmaker with him and Peggotty. And then the simplicity of his life, which might be a little bit of a romantic kind of view of things, but there's a simplicity there. But there's a tremendous loyalty as well, as we see once he's married Peggotty. And then there's that little bit of humor at the end when he's ill and he wants to get some money out, but everybody knows he's got this box of money in his room, and he insists they all leave the room so that he can get to his money so that no one knows he's there. And then I like the book ending of him as a character, where one of his early appearances, he's having this dialogue about him being willing. And then at the end of his life, at the end of his section in the book, he says basically the same thing on his deathbed. So I found that quite sweet.
Excellent. We turn it over to you.
When a man says he's willing, said Mr. Barkis, turning his glance slowly on me again, it's as much as to say, that man's a waiting for an answer. Well, Mr. Barkis? Well, said Mr. Barkis. carrying his eyes back to his horse's ears. "That man's been awaiting for her answer ever since." "Have you told her so, Mr. Barkis?" "No, no," growled Mr. Barkis, reflecting about it. "I ain't got no call to go and tell her so. I never said 6 words to her myself. I ain't a-going to tell her so." "Would you like me to do it, Mr. Barkis?" said I, doubtfully. "You might tell her if you would," said Mr. Barkis, with another slow look at me, "that Barkis was a-waiting for her answer. Says you, what name is it?" "Her name? Ah," said Mr. Barkis, with a nod of his head. "Peggotty." "Christen name or natural name?" said Mr. Barkis. "Oh, it's not her Christian name. Her Christian name is Clara." "Is it, though?" said Mr. Barkis. He seemed to find an immense fund of reflection in this circumstance, and sat pondering and inwardly whistling for some time. "Well," he resumed at length, "says you, Peggotty, Barkis is waiting for her answer. Says she, perhaps, answer to what? Says you, to what I told you. What is that? Says she. Barkis is willing, says you.
Thank you. These are all so fantastic and different, and this is really nice to hear. All right, Nick, we've got some questions for you here.
Far away.
All right, so you've done this title most recently, and one of the questions is, in general, who decides the pronunciation of the words' names? You know, the author, obviously not Dickens, you know, a production assistant, the publisher, this particular... The pronunciation of words and names.
Words and names.
Yeah.
Well, we come to a kind of an agreement between the performer and the producer, I suppose. It's an instinctive thing, I think. You know, it's there on the page, and they're not too unfamiliar. And a lot of the names are descriptive of the character as well. One finds. I mean, I don't think there's a huge problem there. I think it's a consensus, and of course there's plenty of people who've gone before you to help you out with that as well.
Well, the true in the case of Dickens, but what about a modern title where, you know, you've got a lot of science fiction names or fantasy? How do you decide then?
Well, that's different, and also perhaps 19th century Russian literature as well, which is extremely difficult. Where does the stress go? Again, a bit of research on Google, a lot of conversation, and then plump for something and pray you get it right, because if you don't, you're going to have to do it again.
Excellent. All right, now, for our reading here today, when we're talking about David Copperfield, you have picked a scary man. So tell us, why did you pick this character, and why is he scary?
Yes. Again, impossible to pick a favourite. But for me, I think what Dickens does brilliantly, better than any other author I know, is to take minor characters and make them completely unforgettable. He's got a host of characters that are beautifully, sensitively, subtly written, real people. And in amongst that, he kind of peppers this magnificent grotesquerie of certain characters who pop up. And this particular one, who is the pawnbroker who buys David's jacket when he's on his run from London, is a perfect example of that. A kind of real joy of the hideous, the comical and the hideous and the hideously comical, and so also kind of really, for me, reminiscent of, say, somebody like Wilfrid Brambell as Steptoe in Steptoe and Son, an old British TV series and radio series that people may be aware of. That's basically it. Incredible fun to sort of hit these hugely grotesque characters.
Well, let's hear some. Yeah.
Launch into it. Okay.
Oh, my eyes and limbs, what do you want? Oh, my lungs and liver, what do you want? Oh, gurro.
I was so much dismayed by these words, and particularly by the repetition of the last unknown one, which was a kind of rattle in his throat, that I could make no answer. Hereupon the old man, still holding me by the hair, repeated,
Oh, what do you want? Oh, my eyes and limbs, what do you want? Oh, my lungs and liver, what do you want? Oh, garoo! Which he screwed out of himself with an energy that made his eyes start in his head. I wanted to know, I said, trembling, if you would buy a jacket. Oh, let's see the jacket, cried the old man. Oh, my heart on fire, show the jacket to us. Oh, my eyes and limbs, bring the jacket out. With that, he took his trembling hands, which were like the claws of a great bird, out of my hair, and put on a pair of spectacles, not at all ornamental to his inflamed eyes. Oh, how much for the jacket? Cried the old man after examining it. Oh, garoo, how much for the jacket? Half a crown, I answered, recovering myself. Oh, my lungs and liver, cried the old man. No! Oh, my eyes, no! Oh, my limbs, no! 18 pence. Garoo.
That was amazing. You're getting great comments in there. You know, it's been fantastic for us to hear each of you do it and to see it. I love seeing the different facial expressions. Martin, sort of had half his face to the side. It's actually not that interesting to watch an audiobook being recorded many times because you have to be very still. But the facial expressions in Dickens are great. Yes, Martin.
Thanks for that. Just to say, taking on what Simon was saying, that Dickens really is your director. Whether he says it always just before the first line or sometimes it's very shortly afterwards, you have to hang on to Dickens because he tells you how it might be. We've already learned earlier in a few scenes earlier that Dickens says about Uriah, for instance, there was not so much as a smile about him. He merely widened his face so that there were two creases down. And so if you do that, as one tries to nuance it without doing the whole thing, you find that that might give you a way that you would have to speak, given that you're slitting it out from an over-wide mouth. So my version, which is different, obviously, from anybody else's version, everybody has their own David, their own, my version, the voice comes out a bit creepy like that. But it's all to do with Dickens, our director.
Well, see, now everyone has a call to action to go listen to 4 different David Copperfields, and of course start with Audiobook Break, which is running as a podcast. So Nick, question for you. What kind of booth are you currently in? Because we see you're in your recording area.
Well, this was an investment I made during the first lockdown here in the UK. It's a Studio Bricks audio booth. Very useful for me as I don't own the house I live in, I rent, and I had to move and I had to have something that I could bring with me. So that's what I'm in at the moment.
Derek, a question for you. When you record an audiobook, what do you read off of? Are you on an iPad? Do you have the paper copy in hand? I noticed most of us had paper today.
Yeah, no, it's an iPad. I spent some while a few years back, just before I really turned professional and did this full time, recording for the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston, where I was then living. No connection to me, but a wonderful institution. And the only thing was that you had to read from paper scripts, and it was it's just cumbersome. It's time consuming. So I've never done it in my professional career, never will do. So the iPad is fantastic. The only time I have a problem is if the text size is not that big and I need to just squidge it up in size. And then when you do the swipe thing, because you've increased the size, sometimes it won't just slip across. So you do get that little glitch where you're in mid-flow, you've got to flick it over to see how the rest of the sentence runs, and the thing is stuck there, and even little vibration at times, and then it stays as if to taunt you. But otherwise, it's an iPad, and it's fantastically effective.
And do you mark the script up on the iPad with reminders or prompts of any kind?
No, I don't. I'm a little bit like Simon like that, I suppose. I make sure I understand enough of the character that I've got a sense of, who he, she is, they are. But I absolutely don't. I don't think I could just maintain my concentration if there were the equivalent of digital sticky notes all over the script. It's just got to be done in the flow.
Yeah, I just want to throw in there that it comes from a conversation again we had some years back that when I was a BBC newsreader, Jim Black was the head of the presentation department, and he had a thing about newsreaders marking scripts. No, don't mark your scripts, because you just read from mark to mark, pause here, up here at the end of the sentence. And so it sort of stayed with me. And I understand people who actually highlight characters differently. One character will be yellow, one character will be orange, and so on. And I understand the need for that sometimes. But I'm with Derek. I think if you do mark the script, you do tend to rely on that, and it takes you out of the movement of the scene. And for me, it's like you're looking at the script, but you're actually seeing the movie in my head, movie behind the screen. You're sort of seeing through the script. And if you've got lines all over the script, it's sort of, oh, what's that? Oh, I've got to go up at the end here. And you're sort of anticipating that instead of being in the sentence, being in the moment. So.
Yes, what I absolutely agree with you. You mentioned about we all had paper. I don't know if anybody was reading from the book. I got the paperback. I wasn't, and the reason was that when I was falling in love with Dickens at the age of 12, 13, I said to my old grandma, I said, do you like Dickens? And she said, well, I don't really care for Dickens. The print's too small. And so I did have I printed out a little bit of paper. I don't really make marks. I do use, on a music stand, I usually have 3 scripts side by side, because I'm technically not really good enough to be able to do what Derek was just talking about so smoothly. And I do very occasionally make marks if it's a very dense page. I might just give myself a little mark there, or if I've got a Uriah coming up, let's say I was doing Copperfield, I might just put a green dot, because Uriah's color for me is green. David is blue, of course.
I think also,
and I might just do that just as a tiny little subliminal signpost, so that my pathetic brain and mouth just gets to that next speech just that little bit swifter than it might otherwise do. But I don't do it all the time. I used to do a lot more of that, but like you guys, hopefully one can just, as Gerald Moore, the great accompanist, said, live within the music.
I just want to just go again, talking about the paper thing. I mean, I can go back to when I wouldn't do it with this book, because this is one of my grandparents, but it's about the only book I've got, the real book I've got handy right now. But
the print's too small.
Occasionally, you take this and you take a razor blade and cut all the pages out.
Yep.
And then you'd have them flat. The only thing with that then is, and I knew somebody who used to do this. I mean, back in the early days, I'd just retake and we'd have to edit, the page. But you do widows and orphans, that's what was called. So what was you'd take what was on the next page and you write to the end of the sentence and you write that down here. And that would be, I'm not sure which one's the widow and which one's the orphan, or you'd take it at the top of the next page and you'd write the beginning of the sentence at the top of the next page. So as long as you're very quiet turning the pages, you didn't have to turn them mid-sentence, you turn them at the end of the sentence.
Yeah.
So you had to clean
of course, tricky with Dickens, because some of his sentences are about 3 pages long. So I'll occasionally put a little mark in, breathe here. You've got a chance.
I swear by my iPad, this is the large one.
When we were first doing radio dramas years ago, we sat at the feet of some of the great radio actors who had absolutely got the technique of page turning. Yes, and they would, because the mics were very directional, they would be reading, and then they would go very quietly, as you say, and they would take the script towards the dead side of the mic, and they would turn it over as they got to the dead side of the mic and come back. And their technique was absolutely wonderful. And I find myself, because I learned at their feet to some extent, I find sometimes in a radio drama, well, the other day, I can't help but do that.
Which gives rise to that wonderful joke. How do you know if you've got a radio actor in the car with you? He's reading his newspaper completely silently and only ever speaks to you at the traffic lights.
Well, Nick, I've got a question for you. We're talking about, notating characters. How do you tackle female voices? Because we haven't actually done any female voices here.
Well, I mean, which ones? I mean, there are so many different ones. You have somebody like Betsy Trotwood, who's quite a broad character, could be quite a broad character, and then you have you've Dora and you've the mother and so on. You've got all sorts of different kind of notes. And I personally am not one for, unless it's a particularly entertaining maiden aunt, going a bit too far into Lady Bracknell territory. I'll just soften the voice a little and let the character drive the voice rather than try to be a female impersonator.
So here you are in your booth, and you're generally working alone these days, correct?
Yes. Occasionally I'll have a producer on Skype at the other end.
So is there ever any public rehearsal or practice? I know for a radio drama you would certainly do that, but with audiobooks, do you ever rehearse with someone in advance?
I haven't. Generally, the rehearsal is on the actor to do their prep, read ahead, not get too many surprises up ahead, and not fix the character voices, but certainly know how to place them so you don't end up with two people who sound exactly the same speaking to each other on one page. And it's just really getting familiar with the text. I know a lot of actor friends of mine who'll do a vocal warm up. I personally don't. Not for recording. I will do for theatre work, but not close on mic work.
And do you ever actually edit yourself, or you're just sort of picking up the mistakes as you go along?
It depends. I mean, sometimes you'll just record, and some poor editor at the other end will have to take out all of your fluffs, and also come back to you with the pickup saying, "Why did you say leather when it clearly says window?" And you're going, "I was very late. I was very tired. My mouth had turned to rubber." So that's one way, and the other way I've done, which is doing my own punch and roll. I use a piece of software called Reaper at home, which is my digital audio workstation. I'll record onto that, and if I pick up that I've made a mistake, I'll stop, rewind a bit, and I'll get a 3-second punch in, a 3-second playback of what I've just recorded, and then pick up where I left off, and that kind of minimises the need for editing at the other end.
May I just say that that's a very good. I use that quite a lot, because it does mean that the movie that we've been talking about in the head for the viewer listener is what you want to say and how you want to do it. So you're in charge of your own beats when you do. We used to call it rock and roll, and I think you used to call it punch in, but now it's punch in roll, which is great. And it means that we are in charge of the whole pace and drive, rather than a man sitting on a mountaintop or wherever, or a girl editing all the stuff and doing their very best. And there's some wonderful editors around, as we all know. But nevertheless, it doesn't always quite belong to you in the way that you might like it to when you hear it, if indeed you ever do listen back.
It does. It can have a tendency to slow the recording process down, of course, because you're doing your own edits. But that's the only disadvantage, I think.
I don't want to get in an argument here, because I know there's a big issue between people who like punch and roll and people who like straight record. I do straight record. I started in local radio recording and stuff, knowing how to edit reel to reel, yellow pencil, razor blade. So I edit myself. I do a straight record. I leave a marker when I make a mistake. I just drop a marker in. So I fluff a sentence, I pick up immediately. I don't delay, go back 3 seconds or anything like that. I pick up at the beginning of the sentence, whatever, and then I go back, and every marker, I go in very quickly because I'm very fast, and I clean it. That keeps the pacing exactly how I want to. I'm never taken out of the thing having to work technically, but it's because I have a technical level of expertise. And I know there are people who swear by punch and roll and people who swear by what I do, and there can be clashes. I don't mind. People do what they have to do, and that's just my preference, because it keeps me totally in control of what I do, and I love that.
And I think we should be clear, for most professional audiobooks, after the narrator does all of this, whether they roll record or a punch and roll, it does go to a separate editor. That person actually follows along with the text to make sure it doesn't say window instead of, fork. And, they pull things together, take out any sound issues, but they do a fine edit on the piece. And having that second pair of ears is very important when you're putting together a professional audiobook.
Yeah, more than one. I mean, there's some
Yes.
publishers do quality control after that, and it's essential. And I don't think there's any narrator in the world who doesn't get a list of corrections back within a few days where they said leather instead of window, or window instead of leather. That's good. Leather, and I will now get confused with leather and window in my next book. But,
there you go.
Great. Yeah, we're very grateful because it's
pray you don't have any leather windows.
I can tell you from behind the scenes all the crazy stories we've gotten from these four, not just about Dickens, but about recording. We could do a whole nother webinar just talking about their crazy stories of recording. All right, Derek, I've got a question for you. Any particularly challenging issues when narrating a classic as compared with something that's new and modern?
Essentially, probably not. But I would say that what I have been very aware of doing Copperfield recently is the need to not layer over what you're reading in the script with your own or maybe society's own current norms and accepted behaviors, and then subtly maybe, but affecting somehow the way in which you then relate to that character and end up voicing that character. It's probably unlikely, but I just try to really maintain that level of awareness that there is a difference between when this was written, how people thought, and therefore not to let that get in the way. But otherwise, no, it's the actual, if you like, the technique that I bring to prepping and performing is going to be the same, whether it's a classic or a sci-fi or romance or whatever it is.
I think that's perfectly put. The only thing I'd say is that every book is different, of course, whether it's a classic or whether it's modern. And say, for instance, we were talking about Betsy Trotwood. Her character, you certainly don't want to do a Lady Bracknell or a cliche Lady Bracknell on, say, Betsy. There's a kind of dedicated directness, I feel, about that character. And so that nuance in the back of your head as you're shooting on the screen for the listener, maybe, is just her attitude, which is nothing to do with putting on a voice, which you might do in a crazy other thing. And the other thing about the modern thing is somehow, and particularly Simon is so very, very good at this, you can tell a whole story, and it's all about telling the story, without changing your voice at all. If you, in, say, a modern thriller, you know, as the detective inspector, I came into the room. I asked the man in the corner what he was doing. "I'm doing nothing," he said. "What do you mean you're doing nothing?" said the girl over. "And I'm not changing my voice at all, but I'm hoping to tell the story and keep it clear, because if I did it in a way that I was doing a slightly florid period thing, you'd be tempted to change the nuances just that bit more. And what you'll be doing then is taking the story away from the listener, because you must always keep the listener in your mind."
That's an excellent point. Now I'm going to ask for a show of hands because I think I know the answer to this. How many of you have listened to books you previously recorded?
I'm going to say,
Maybe.
if I'm researching another book in a series, if I've got a series, I will often, crazily, because I got some of the recordings, but it's easier if I just download them from Audible. I'll use up a credit and I'll go back, and I will often sit there. I do a lot of fantasy as well. So you're in the fourth installment. I'll have the scripts for the other ones on my computer, and if a character comes up that I know was in the third book, I mean, if you're really smart, you make notes as you go. And I know our friend Scott
Yes.
Brick does that. He gets whole sort of files of stuff. And I've already mentioned I'm lazy. I don't do that. So I'll get the script up. I'll do a search for the character where it says he said. I'll then go onto the character, onto the book that I recorded 3 times ago. So it's very limited listening. I'm not listening. I will sometimes, though, in the days prior to starting the book, I will listen to the first few chapters or a few other chapters while I'm doing something else, just to get the sense of the rhythm and the timing and the mood of the piece, just to recollect how I attacked it in the past. So I don't suddenly come in, the first book was all this, and the second book is, well, there we go, you know.
I think that's true. If you've got a series, I've been lucky enough to narrate a lot of P.G. Wodehouse, and sometimes you just want to remind yourself of how Bertie Wooster, or in the other tranche of titles, how Lord Emsworth was. And I wouldn't probably listen to more than, I don't know, a page, half a page, just to be sure that for those people who are going to write to you, starting their letter, why, oh, why did you make him different? You want to be just sure that it's the same person, that listener who was kind enough to listen into your production has enjoyed, you hope.
Well, the worst one I get, it's not entirely connected here, but I get letters every so often, or emails, I should say.
Yes.
Why does the professor in this book sound the same as the teacher in that one, or the butcher? Why do they have the same voice? It's me.
Exactly.
Note to self: don't overuse stock character 63B.
Well, that brings me to a question for you, Nick. How do you know if the recording is going well if you're there alone in the booth? You don't have a director, you don't have any feedback.
You don't, do you? I suppose is the answer to that. You've no idea. You just pray that it is, and trust your instincts, trust your experience, trust what you're doing, I suppose, and enjoy yourself. If you're enjoying yourself, but not too much, then with any luck, your listeners will be enjoying themselves too.
Now, Derek, you record a lot of different genres. Do you have a favorite genre?
I think my glib answer to that is I don't have a favorite genre, but my favorite is a book that's well written. And actually, that's not really so glib. It's the truth. I find that when we go back to Copperfield. I mean, here's a book written a long time ago in relative terms, but there's an incredible quality to it that makes it just a dream to narrate. There have fortunately been relatively few books that I have cursed quietly on each at the end or the beginning or throughout each page. But no, I mean, each genre obviously has its differences, but I think it's the quality of the writing for me that's the key to it, and once that's there, the rest follows.
Now, is David Copperfield in particular one of the better Dickens that you've had the chance to read aloud?
It's the only Dickens I've had the chance to read aloud.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's I'm the novice of the group as far as that goes. Yeah, it's the only Dickens. I hope not the last one, but the only one so far. Yeah.
And Simon, I'm curious.
Sorry, I'm just going to say, I don't know whether the question was, I'm just picking up on that. I haven't read anything like all the Dickens. I'm sure somebody has. I've read 3 or 4, including Tale of Two Cities, Hard Times, and I was going to say Great Expectations.
Yes.
Because, well, we're talking about Charles Dickens' genius. He then writes 10 years later another autobiographical novel that's completely different from David Copperfield. It's got a first-person hero called Pip, and who wants to be a gentleman and comes from somewhere down on the Essex-Kent marshes, brought up in the forge, by his sister and her blacksmith husband. He's probably got some kind of a rural accent that's somewhere over there, and he's ambitious. That's the same as David Copperfield in the other novel, but and that sets its own problems and joys, just as Copperfield did. And so it's just as exciting and just as great a novel. I don't know, some people might like Great Expectations better because it's only half the length of David Copperfield.
That is true.
You're hoping that the sentences might be half the length as well. I've only done one other Dickens, and that's Nicholas Nickleby. But I'm pretty sure that David Timpson has read all of Dickens for Naxos. I hope I'm not mistaken there.
Yeah.
If
well,
not, he's done
he'd be a
nearly all
great
of it.
person to. He's a wonderfully fluid, imaginative reader performer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I've done pretty much all of them.
Do you have a favorite?
I did enjoy Great Expectations tremendously, and not just because it is only 18 hours rather than 30 something. It's just a lovely, I mean, Martin, all authors, the best authors write what they know. So no wonder he used that, his source material was extraordinary. But yeah, no, I mean, I think I mentioned a year or so ago back to somebody that I hadn't done Pickwick Papers, and boom, it arrived on my desk, and I loved it. It was fun. He's such a fun writer. I mean, Derek talked about the difficulty of some books, and I've likened it to, some books you're wading through mud every day. I've got to get from here to here, and it's other times you're skipping the surface like a stone. It's like tung 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 tung, and it's like it's you don't even know you've read 5 pages, and you're there. I have some writers that I love, contemporary writers that there's one just mentioned. He's this guy Gabriel Cage just finished his latest, sent it off the first draft to the publisher. He said, just so you know, it's coming out May next year. I can't wait because it's such a joy to read good writing. And Dickens is absolutely up there. Yeah.
Well, this has been so lovely. I think we've all learned a lot. I love that you all have Dickens close to your heart in so many ways. So thank you very much to Nick, Derek, Simon, and Martin for joining us here today, to the AudioFile staff for putting this all together, and to our audience who we can't see, but we know are there. We appreciate all your comments and questions. And we are coming up to another webinar coming up on May 6th at noon Eastern Time. We'll be talking to narrators about welcoming voices, stories of new Americans for young listeners. Right. So lots of interest in children's audio since we've all gone into lockdown. But thank you all for coming. If you've liked what you've heard here today, we do hope that you will follow, rate, and review on your favorite podcast app, Audiobook Break, which is all Nick all the time reading David Copperfield. So that's a chapter by chapter listening experience, and Naxos Audiobooks put it together, but we're bringing it out over the course of several months. And you can find that and our Behind the Mic podcast at audiofilemagazine.com. We hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and we so appreciate you joining us here today. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.